She was handcuffed on the side of a dark road at 12:47 in the morning, wearing scrubs still damp from a 12-hour shift, while a police officer stood next to her car with a smile that said he already knew how this story ended. He was wrong. He had no idea who he had just stopped. Because the woman kneeling on the gravel shoulder of Route 9 outside Fairmont City had once carried wounded soldiers out of places most people couldn't find on a map. She had stitched arterial bleeds in the dark with her hands shaking and her ears ringing from incoming fire. She had survived things that would have broken anyone who hadn't chosen, deliberately and completely, to become someone else. Officer Brandon Cross thought he'd found an easy mark. He had found the worst possible mistake of his career. If this story already has you gripping your seat, follow along, hit like, and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The shift had started like every other Tuesday. Emily Parker arrived at Westbrook Medical Center at 6:58 in the evening, 2 minutes before her scheduled start, the way she always did. She stopped at the locker room long enough to swap her jacket for a set of scrubs, clip her badge to her chest, and pull her hair back into a knot that was functional rather than careful. She was 31 years old, average height, the kind of face people forgot until they needed her and then never forgot again. She had worked the emergency department at Westbrook for almost 3 years, and in that time she had developed exactly the reputation you would expect from someone who kept her head down and let the work speak. She was good, genuinely good, in the way that meant less about training and more about instinct, about knowing when a patient was going to crash before the monitor said so, about staying calm when everyone else in the room was starting to lose it. The ER attending on her shift, Dr. Marcus Webb, had once told a new resident that Parker had better situational awareness than half the trauma surgeons he'd trained under, and then he'd gone back to his chart and said nothing else because that was the kind of thing he only said once. Emily didn't know he'd said it. She probably wouldn't have cared. The night started manageable. 2 chest pain evaluations, a pediatric asthma case, a 30-year-old who had sliced his palm open on a broken jar and was trying very hard not to faint. She moved between them with the unhurried efficiency of someone who had long since stopped treating urgency as something to perform. Around 9, the volume picked up. A 4-car accident on the interstate fed 3 patients into the department inside 20 minutes. A man came in from a house fire with second-degree burns covering his forearms and one side of his neck. A teenager was brought in unconscious and smelling of alcohol, her mother standing in the waiting room looking like the floor had opened up beneath her. Emily handled them in sequence. Not perfectly. She asked for a second set of hands on the burn patient and had to wait 6 minutes longer than she wanted to for a portable X-ray cart, but competently. The way things got done in an ER that was understaffed by 2 nurses and had been that way for 4 months. She didn't complain about it. She didn't complain about much. By midnight, the department had quieted enough that her charge nurse, a heavy-set man named Gerald Kwan, who had been running this floor for 11 years, told her to go ahead and clock out. She'd logged nearly 13 hours. She had a follow-up shift the next evening. She said goodnight, changed back into her street clothes, and walked to her car in the far corner of the hospital parking structure because that was where she always parked, on the 4th level near the stairwell, since it was the only lot where she'd never had her side mirror clipped. She pulled out of the parking structure at 12:31 a.m. and got on Route 9 heading north. She had made this drive maybe 500 times. She didn't make it to the end. The blue and red lights appeared in her rearview mirror about 4 miles past the hospital, out near the stretch of road where the commercial zoning ended and gave way to scrubby dark fields on both sides. She checked her speed. She was going 43 in a 45 zone. She had her seatbelt on. She signaled, pulled smoothly to the shoulder, and put the car in park. She'd been stopped twice before in her life. Once for a brake light she hadn't known was out. Once for rolling a stop sign in a parking lot during an ice storm. She was not nervous. She had no reason to be nervous. The officer took his time getting out of the cruiser. Long enough that Emily noticed it. Not alarm, just the small registration of something slightly off-tempo. When he finally came to her window, she had her license and registration ready on the console in front of her. He was probably 28, broad through the shoulders, square jaw, the particular set of a man who wore authority like it was the most natural thing in the world and always had been. His badge said, Cross. He shone his light straight into her face without angling it down, which was a small thing, but not an accident. "License and registration," he said. "Right here." She held them out the window. He took them without looking at her. Spent a moment examining them, though not so long that he seemed to be reading anything carefully. "Where are you coming from tonight?" "Work. I'm a nurse at Westbrook Medical." "Long night?" "Long enough." He handed her documents back and shone his light slowly around the interior of the car, across the back seat, down into the footwell on the passenger side. He lingered there a moment. "Step out of the vehicle, please." Emily paused, just one beat. "Is there a reason?" "I'm asking you to step out of the vehicle." She got out. She stood on the gravel shoulder with her hands visible, not because she was frightened, but because she understood how these moments worked, and she had no interest in giving anyone a reason to make them worse. The air was cold. The road was empty in both directions. There were no other cars, no pedestrians, no buildings with lit windows. "Turn around, hands on the roof." She did it. "You have anything in the car I should know about? Weapons, drugs, anything like that?" "No." "You mind if I take a look?" She did mind. She had a clear right to say so. "I'd prefer you didn't." "I'm going to need you to consent to a search." I'm not consenting to a search." Cross made a small sound, not quite a laugh. He walked back to his cruiser. She heard the door open and close. He came back. "I'm getting a reading on my K9 unit's preliminary scan," he said. "That gives me probable cause." There was no K9 unit. There was no other officer present. She had watched him get back in his cruiser and return empty-handed, and she had not heard any dog. She stood on the gravel and said nothing, because saying something would have required a tone she wasn't ready to use. Not yet. Not while she still wanted to believe this would resolve itself through normal channels. It did not resolve itself. Cross went to the front passenger door of her car, opened it, and crouched beside the seat. Emily watched from 6 feet away, standing still, hands loose at her sides. She watched him reach into the pocket of his jacket. She watched him produce a small plastic bag, the kind with a zip-close seal, the kind that held maybe an ounce, and she watched him tuck it under the edge of the passenger seat with the smooth, practiced motion of a man who had done this before. The bag held a white, powdery substance. He straightened up, turned to her. "That's not mine," Emily said. Her voice was even. "That's what they all say." He was already unclipping the handcuffs from his belt. "Turn around." She turned around. The metal clicked into place around her wrists. She stared at a point in the dark distance, past the fields, past the tree line, and she breathed steadily through her nose the way a field medic learns to breathe when there is nothing useful to do yet, and doing nothing is the correct choice. "You have the right to remain silent," Cross said behind her. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." She remained silent. He walked her to the cruiser and put her in the back seat. He called in the arrest. She could hear him through the mesh partition, his voice easy and confident, telling dispatch he had a female on a narcotics stop, that she'd been uncooperative, that she'd failed a field sobriety assessment. He hadn't administered a field sobriety assessment. She had not been uncooperative. She filed these facts away carefully, each one, the way you file useful information when you know you're going to need it later. She did not cry. She did not demand to speak to anyone. She sat in the back of the cruiser with her hands behind her, and she looked out at the dark road, and she thought, with a clarity that was almost cold, that Cross had made an error he was not going to be able to walk back from. She also thought, not yet. Let it breathe. Let him think he's won. She had learned that in a different context, years ago, in a different kind of situation entirely, but the principle held. But Westbrook Medical Center received the notification at 1:17 a.m. through the routine law enforcement channel that went to the hospital administrator on call. By 6 in the morning, when the day shift was coming in, the information had reached Dr. Pauline Ferris, Chief of Nursing Operations, who had a reputation for decisive action and a particular sensitivity to anything that created liability exposure for the institution. Ferris was not a cruel person. She was, however, a careful one. And careful people in institutional positions sometimes made decisions that looked, from the outside, like callousness. She reviewed the report. An arrest on narcotics charges. A current employee. She called Gerald Kwan, who said he couldn't believe it, and she said that wasn't what she was asking, and she made a decision before 9 o'clock that morning. Emily Parker was placed on administrative suspension pending the outcome of the criminal investigation. Her badge access was revoked. Her shifts were covered. A form letter was generated by the HR department and sent to her last known address, which was, at that moment, not where Emily was. Emily was in a holding cell on the second floor of the Fairmont City Police Department. The cell was 8 feet by 10. There was a bench bolted to the wall, a steel toilet, a fluorescent light that buzzed at the exact frequency most likely to make your teeth clench. Emily sat on the bench with her back against the cinder block wall and her elbows on her knees, and she looked at the opposite wall without looking at anything. Around 7 in the morning, Brandon Cross appeared outside the cell. He'd gone home at some point. He was in street clothes, a gray Henley and jeans, off duty. He stood outside the bars with his hands in his pockets and looked at her the way a man looks at something he's won. "Your hospital called," he said. "Sounds like they're not waiting around." Emily looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at the opposite wall again. "Nobody's coming to save you," Cross said. "You know that, right? No union rep, no lawyer, no—" He stopped. "You're just a nurse. Nobody's going to go to the mat over a nurse with a drug charge." "I know," Emily said. He seemed to find this unsatisfying. He stood there a moment longer, then turned and walked away down the corridor. Emily counted the buzzing intervals of the fluorescent light. 37 cycles per minute, approximately. She thought about the burn patient from last night and whether the attending had remembered to order the updated wound dressing protocol. She thought about whether she'd left anything in her locker that was time-sensitive. She thought, very briefly, about a specific late afternoon in a place she didn't allow herself to name very often, when she had kept her hand steady on a man who was losing blood faster than she could work. And the only thing that had mattered in that moment was the exact next thing to do. She thought, the exact next thing to do. Then she sat quietly and waited for it. What Brandon Cross did not know, what almost no one at the Fairmont City Police Department knew, was that 3 weeks earlier, a federal oversight unit operating under the Department of Justice's Anti-Corruption Initiative had opened an active inquiry into the FCPD's Traffic Enforcement Division. The inquiry had been triggered by a pattern of complaints, 24 of them filed over an 18-month period, almost entirely from veterans. Complaints of evidence planting, fabricated violations, coercive arrests. The complaints had gone nowhere locally. They had eventually gone somewhere else. The oversight unit had been quietly installing surveillance equipment at strategic points along the most common patrol routes in Fairmont City's northern districts. Not visible cameras, the kind of equipment that mounted inside existing traffic infrastructure, the kind that could capture high-resolution footage without appearing to be anything other than a sensor array for traffic management. The relevant section of Route 9 had been equipped 6 days ago. Emily Parker had not known about the surveillance when Cross pulled her over. But she'd known something else. She'd known from the moment he came to her window that something about the stop was constructed, the way he lingered on her documents without reading them, the way he angled the flashlight, the way he returned to his cruiser before announcing probable cause. These were not the behaviors of an officer acting on instinct. These were the behaviors of someone running a script. She had seen that before too. In another context with different stakes but the same basic shape. She had made the decision on the gravel shoulder of Route 9 at 12:47 a.m. to let the script play out, because fighting it in the moment, raising her voice, demanding explanations, asserting her rights in a way that would escalate the interaction, would produce a different kind of footage than staying quiet and compliant. She understood what compliant footage of a clean arrest looked like next to footage of an officer staging evidence. She needed both. She also understood that she had resources Brandon Cross did not know about. Her military service had ended formally 18 months ago. What had not ended, and what she had never discussed with anyone at Westbrook Medical Center, was her affiliation with a veterans advocacy program embedded within a federal oversight structure. It was not classified. It was not secret. It was simply not something she talked about because it had never been relevant to her life as a nurse. It had become relevant now. She had been unable to make any calls from the cell. That was fine. She had a protocol for this situation, established when she enrolled in the program, because the program anticipated situations exactly like this. 72 hours of silence, and then someone checked on her. That was the framework. She had been here less than 7 hours. She was not in a hurry. By late afternoon, the story had made its quiet way through Westbrook Medical Center, the way stories do in hospitals. Not through official channels, but through break rooms and hallway conversations, and the particular velocity of information that moves between people who spend 12 hours together in close proximity. Gerald Kwan had told someone he trusted, who had told someone they trusted, and by 3 o'clock, a version of the story had circulated far enough that 2 of the physicians Emily worked with regularly had heard about it. Dr. Marcus Webb heard about it at 3:15 while he was charting between patients. He sat still for a moment after the resident who'd told him finished talking. Then he asked, carefully, what the charge was. Narcotics, the resident said. Webb looked at his chart for a moment. That's not right, he said. I know, it seems... No, I mean it's factually not right, Webb said. I've worked with that woman for 3 years. I've seen her under pressure that would make most people make mistakes. She doesn't make mistakes. And she doesn't... He stopped. He set his pen down. Who's her attending on the case? The resident looked confused. She's not a patient. I know she's not a patient. I mean, who's handling her from the hospital's side? Who's she got? The resident didn't know. Webb found out 15 minutes later through a phone call to HR that he conducted in his office with the door closed. The answer, which was that Emily Parker was on suspension pending investigation with no hospital representation yet assigned, made him rub his eyes with the heels of his hands for a long moment. Then he called an attorney he knew. He couldn't do much from where he stood. He understood that. But he could make sure someone who could do something knew the situation before another night passed. 2 floors below and across the city, inside the Fairmont City PD holding facility, Emily Parker had finished her second meal from a tray slid through the cell door. She had eaten it without complaint. She had not spoken except when directly asked a question. She had maintained the particular quality of stillness that tended to make the officers on duty vaguely uncomfortable. The way stillness without apparent distress tends to be unsettling in a context designed to produce distress. Cross came back once more, around 6 in the evening, this time in uniform, back on shift. He stood outside the cell again, and this time his expression was harder to read. Your suspension went through, he said. Hospital made it official. Emily nodded once. You have a public defender assigned. He'll see you tomorrow morning. Cross paused. You want to tell me now what you were doing with that much product in your vehicle? It's going to go a lot better for you. She looked at him. I wasn't doing anything with it, because it wasn't mine. The evidence says different. The evidence is what you put there. Cross's jaw tightened, just slightly, just enough. That's a serious allegation, he said. It's an accurate one. He held her gaze for another 3 seconds. Then he turned and walked away again. Emily turned back to the wall. She was thinking about the camera angles she'd estimated when Cross walked her to his cruiser, the positioning of the closest traffic infrastructure, the wind direction that night, and whether it would have affected acoustic capture. She was running through variables the way she'd been trained to run through variables, methodically, without attachment to any particular outcome, because attachment to outcomes was a luxury you couldn't afford when the situation was still in motion. She was calm, not the performance of calm, the actual thing, the kind that comes from having been in worse situations and coming out the other side of them. She was still sitting exactly where she'd been sitting 8 hours later when the lights in the corridor dimmed for the overnight cycle and the facility went quiet. She was still there when, at 11:53 p.m., a notification went through an encrypted federal communications channel to an office in a building 2 states away, flagging her name against an active roster. She had no way to know about the notification. But if she had, she would not have been surprised. She would have said, there it is, and then she would have waited. At 6:04 in the morning, the day shift supervisor at Fairmont City PD, a lieutenant named Harold Yates, arrived at headquarters for what he fully expected to be a routine briefing. He got coffee from the machine in the break room. He checked the overnight log. He noted that the Parker narcotics arrest from the previous night was still clean, still processing, still exactly what Cross had reported. He settled into the briefing room chair. At 6:21, a front desk officer came in and told him there were federal vehicles in the parking lot. Yates looked up from his notes. What kind of federal vehicles? 3 black SUVs, and the officer hesitated. There's a military vehicle. Looks like Army. Yates set down his coffee. And sir, the officer said, they're asking for the officer who made the Parker arrest. For one long moment, Yates stared at the wall across from him, and the briefing room that had been routine 12 seconds ago was not routine anymore. And somewhere in the back of his mind, a feeling that he would later describe as the bottom dropping out began to take hold. He stood up. He went to the window. In the parking lot below, 3 black SUVs were pulled up in a tight cluster near the entrance, and beside them, engine still running, sat a vehicle that was very clearly not standard civilian law enforcement. Several figures in civilian federal agency windbreakers were standing near the entrance. 2 more figures were in uniform, military uniforms, and one of them was already walking toward the front door. Yates watched them for a moment. Then he turned away from the window and walked, with careful composure, down the hall toward the holding cells. When he reached the cell where Emily Parker had spent the night, he stopped outside the bars. She was sitting in the same position he'd seen in the intake photos, back against the wall, elbows on knees. She looked up when he stopped. "Ms. Parker," Yates said. His voice had an unfamiliar quality in it. "Is there something you'd like to tell me before we go back upstairs?" Emily considered the question. "I'd like my personal belongings," she said, "and I'd like the cell unlocked." Yates looked at her for another moment. He couldn't quite place what it was about her face, not defiance exactly, nothing so simple, more like someone who has been waiting for a train and knows, with certainty, that it is pulling into the station. He pulled out his key. The key turned in the lock with a sound that felt louder than it had any right to be. Yates pulled the cell door open and stepped back. Emily stood, straightened her scrubs, still wearing them, still damp at the collar from the previous night, and walked out without hurrying. She didn't look at him with triumph. She didn't look at him with anything in particular. She just walked, and he followed, and that was somehow worse than if she'd said something cutting. They went up the stairwell and into the main corridor of the second floor. Through the glass partition ahead, Emily could see the briefing room. And through the briefing room's far windows, she could see the parking lot, the black SUVs, the military vehicle sitting at an angle that suggested whoever drove it hadn't been concerned with staying in the lines. 2 officers were standing near the corridor entrance with the specific posture of men who had been told to wait and weren't sure what they were waiting for. Federal agents were already inside. She counted 3 of them in the corridor before she reached the briefing room door, 2 in DOJ windbreakers, 1 in plain clothes with a lanyard that marked him as something she didn't try to read from this distance. The military investigators were elsewhere, which meant they were probably downstairs near the evidence room, which was where she would have gone first. Lieutenant Yates opened the briefing room door and she walked in. The room held a long table, 12 chairs, a whiteboard that still had the previous day's patrol assignments on it. Standing near the far wall was a woman in her mid-40s wearing a charcoal blazer and the expression of someone who had conducted many of these mornings and found them neither satisfying nor unpleasant. They were simply what the work looked like. Her name was Special Agent Diane Rourke, and Emily knew her name because they had spoken twice before, once at an intake session 18 months ago, and once on a phone call 7 months after that. And Rourke was not the kind of person you forgot after speaking to. Rourke looked at Emily, then she looked at Yates. "Lieutenant," she said, "we're going to need the room." Yates looked between them. Something was happening in his face that he was trying to control and mostly succeeding at. "Agent Rourke, I think I should—" "You're welcome to stand in the corridor," Rourke said. It wasn't unkind. It was simply a statement of what his options were. He left. The door closed. Rourke studied Emily for a moment with the appraising focus of someone who was not performing concern but was actually checking. "You look terrible," she said. 13-hour shift before the arrest, Emily said. "I didn't sleep much." "Any injuries? Nothing like that." Emily pulled out one of the briefing room chairs and sat down, because her legs were more tired than she'd allowed herself to acknowledge. He was careful. Physical coercion would have complicated his story. Rourke nodded. She set a tablet on the table between them and turned it so Emily could see the screen. "You know what this is?" Emily looked at the footage. It was high resolution, better than she'd estimated, shot from an angle she hadn't been able to place the night before, which meant the mounting point was somewhere in the overhead structure of the Route 9 underpass, about 60 yards south of the stop. The timestamp in the corner read 12:47:03. She watched Cross come to her window. She watched herself hand him the documents. She watched him walk back to his cruiser, pause, return. Then she watched his hand go into his jacket pocket. The image was clear enough that she could see the texture of the evidence bag. She could see his thumb press against the zip seal to confirm it was closed before he reached under the seat. She could see the exact angle of his body, turned slightly away from the direction a witness would stand, if there had been a witness, but not turned away from the traffic infrastructure camera mounted 60 yards south. "How much of this is usable in court?" Emily asked. "All of it," Rourke said. "Chain of custody is clean. The equipment installation was documented 8 days ago. We have the metadata, the timestamp verification, the angle mapping. There's no gap in the footage between when he returned to his cruiser and when he placed the bag." She paused. "It's clean, Emily. This is a clean case." Emily looked at the frozen image on the tablet. Cross's hand, mid-motion, the bag visible between his fingers. "Good," she said. There was a knock at the briefing room door. Rourke called, "Come in," and a younger agent entered, late 20s, carrying a folder that he set in front of Rourke without making eye contact with Emily, which told Emily he'd been briefed on who she was and was mildly nervous about it for reasons she didn't have the energy to address right now. "The partner's in room 3, the agent said. He came in voluntarily. Rourke's expression shifted slightly. "Before or after we arrived?" "Before. He was waiting in the parking lot when our first vehicle pulled in." Rourke looked at Emily. Emily looked at the wall. "He knew," Emily said. It wasn't a question. "Seems like it." Rourke closed the tablet. "His name is Officer Danny Reyes. He's been Cross's partner for 8 months. 24 years old, 14 months on the job total." She stood. "You don't need to be in the room for that conversation." "I know," Emily said. "I want something to eat and somewhere I can make a phone call." "We can do that." "And I want to know the moment Cross is in custody." "You'll know," Rourke said. Buzz. Brandon Cross arrived for his shift at 7:15, the same way he always did, parked in his usual spot on the south side of the lot, checked his phone once before getting out of the car, went to the locker room to switch into his uniform. He'd slept well. He'd had no particular reason not to. The Parker arrest was logged, processed, moving through the system the way these things moved, and by the time it got to arraignment, it would be another unremarkable file in a long queue of unremarkable files. He was adjusting his badge in the locker room mirror when a colleague came in through the far door and stopped when he saw Cross. "Hey," the colleague said. His name was Officer Tran Nguyen, and he'd worked this department for 6 years, and his face in this moment was doing something it usually didn't do, which was avoiding direct contact with Cross's eyes. "Shift briefing's been moved." "To where?" "Main briefing room. Yates said everyone's supposed to report there." A pause. "There's federal people here." Cross turned back to the mirror. He straightened the badge a final time. "What kind of federal?" Nguyen hesitated. "DOJ, looks like, and some military." Cross didn't let his expression change in the mirror. Was good at that. He'd always been good at that, the management of his face in circumstances where the face wanted to do something it shouldn't. "Okay," he said. "Probably the Harkins review. They've been coming for weeks." Nguyen didn't say anything to that. He left, and Cross stood alone in front of the mirror for another few seconds, and then he straightened his collar and walked out. He got to the main corridor outside the briefing room at 7:22. There were people in the corridor he didn't recognize, 2 of them, near the door, with the specific build and stillness of people who spent time watching things. He took note of them and kept moving. He was almost to the briefing room door when one of them stepped sideways, not aggressively, just enough to interrupt the natural path to the door. "Officer Cross," the man said. Cross stopped. "Yeah." "Would you come with me, please?" It wasn't framed as a question. Cross looked at the man's lanyard, Federal ID DOJ Division. He didn't recognize at this distance, and then he looked past him toward the briefing room, where through the glass he could see that the room was occupied, and then he looked back at the man's face. "What's this about?" Cross said. "We'll explain inside." Cross thought about several things in a very compressed period of time. He thought about the arrest report he'd filed, which was clean, which was consistent with his training, which followed the procedural template he'd used successfully 11 times before. He thought about the storage locker where he kept the supply he used for these situations, and whether anything there was traceable to him, and he'd already confirmed 3 days ago that it wasn't. He thought about Danny Reyes, who had been present during 2 of the earlier stops, and who had said nothing, done nothing, written nothing, and who Cross had assessed, without particular anxiety, as someone who had made his calculation and intended to keep making it. He thought, this is manageable. This is what manageable looks like. "Sure," he said. "Whatever you need." He walked into the room with them. The briefing room that Cross entered was not the same room it had been an hour ago. The whiteboard with the patrol assignments had been cleared. The chairs on the far side of the table were occupied. 2 DOJ agents, one of whom Cross didn't recognize, and one of whom he did vaguely from a department review 2 years back that had gone nowhere. At the end of the table, standing rather than sitting, was a woman in a charcoal blazer with the specific bearing of someone who had already reached her conclusions before she walked in the door. The screen at the front of the room was on. Cross looked at the screen. Then he looked away from it. Then he looked back. The image on the screen was a still frame from what was clearly a surveillance recording. High angle, good resolution, Route 9, just past the underpass. He could see his own cruiser, and a few feet away, a car he recognized. The still frame showed a moment he recognized too, except from this angle. From this particular angle, it looked like something he would not have chosen to have filmed. "Have a seat, Officer Cross," the woman in the blazer said. He sat down. His face was composed. His face was very composed. "I'm Special Agent Diane Rourke," she said, "and I'm going to tell you what's going to happen in the next few minutes, so there aren't any surprises. We're going to watch some footage together. Then you're going to have the opportunity to speak with an attorney before we continue. Those are your options right now. Do you understand?" "I understand," Cross said. His voice was even. Rourke nodded at the agent near the screen. The footage began to play. Cross watched it. He watched himself exit his cruiser and approach the stopped vehicle. He watched the entire stop play out from an angle he had not known existed, from a camera he had not known was there, with a resolution that left nothing ambiguous about what his right hand was doing at 12:52:17 a.m. He watched himself reach under the passenger seat. He watched himself stand up. The room was very quiet. "That's not what it looks like," Cross said. Nobody in the room said anything. "That footage could be... There are ways to manipulate." "Officer Cross," Rourke said, "I'm going to stop you there. Your attorney will have access to the full chain of custody documentation, the metadata verification, and the equipment installation records, which predate the arrest by 8 days. I would save the technical challenges for the discovery phase." She paused. "Right now, is there anything you'd like to say before we proceed?" Cross looked at the frozen image on the screen. He looked at it for a long time. Then he looked at the door. "You need to think carefully about what you're about to do," Rourke said quietly, "because we're not here about one stop. You understand that, don't you? We're not here about last night." Something moved across Cross's face, something that wasn't quite fear but was adjacent to it, the kind of thing that only shows up when a person realizes the problem is larger than they thought it was. "I want an attorney," he said. "Absolutely," Rourke said. "That's your right." She nodded at the agent by the door. The agent stepped out into the corridor, and 30 seconds later he stepped back in with 2 other agents, and Brandon Cross, who had arrived for work that morning planning a Tuesday that looked a lot like all his other Tuesdays, was placed under arrest. He didn't resist. That was the only smart thing he did in the entire morning. Emily was in a small room off the main corridor, not a holding room, just a room with a table and some chairs and a coffee machine that worked. When she heard the shift in ambient noise that told her something had happened down the hall. Not loud, just a change in the quality of the sounds, the particular tone of a situation moving from potential to actual. She poured the rest of her coffee down the sink because it had gone cold 20 minutes ago, and she'd been too tired to notice, and she was standing at the window when Rourke's young agent knocked on the door. "He's in custody," the agent said. Emily turned from the window. "How'd he play it?" "Composed until the footage, then not." She nodded. "His partner, Reyes. What's his situation?" "Cooperating." The agent hesitated. "He's not in a great place. Emotionally." "He's 24 and his partner just got arrested," Emily said. "Give him a minute." She picked up the jacket that one of the DOJ staff had brought her own jacket, collected from her car, which had been impounded the night before, and she put it on. She was still in the scrubs she'd worn to work the previous evening. Her hair had come down from the knot sometime around 2 in the morning. She was aware that she looked nothing like what most people, if pressed, would picture when they imagined the person at the center of a federal operation. She didn't particularly care, but she was aware of it. She followed the agent out into the corridor. Rourke was waiting near the briefing room door. Beside her was a man Emily hadn't seen yet this morning, tall, wearing a civilian suit, but carrying himself with the specific posture of someone whose most formative professional years had been spent in uniform. He had a folder under one arm and the careful energy of someone with a lot of information, and not all of it welcome. "Emily, this is Special Investigator Joel Ferris," Rourke said. "He's been running the background side of this." Ferris shook her hand. His grip was brief and businesslike. "Before we go further," he said, "there are some things that came up overnight that are going to affect the scope of what happens next." Emily looked at him. "Okay. How much do you know about the department's complaint history, specifically in the Traffic Enforcement Division?" "I know there was a pattern. 24 complaints over 18 months. I know most of them were veterans. That's part of why the program flagged this area." 24 filed complaints, Ferris said. "We're now looking at something closer to 41. The other 17 were, suppressed isn't quite the right word, redirected. There's an internal routing protocol in this department that was being used to categorize certain complaints as administratively resolved before they reached the review board. No review, no record, no follow-up." Emily was quiet for a moment. "Who was making that call?" "That's what makes this more complicated than a single officer case," Ferris said. He opened the folder. She couldn't see all of what was in it, but she could see a page that held an organizational chart, and several names on that chart had been circled in red. The names went higher than she'd expected. She looked at the chart. She looked at Ferris. "How long has this been going on?" she asked. "Best estimate? 4 years. Maybe longer." He paused. Cross was not the originating problem. He was a product of the environment, which doesn't reduce his personal culpability. He made choices, but it means that arresting him and stopping there would be doing about 30% of the job. Rourke had been watching this exchange. "The scope of the investigation is going to expand this morning," she said. "Cross's arrest is the first public action, but it won't be the last. There are warrants pending for records access at the administrative level, and we have a meeting in 40 minutes with the department's Civilian Oversight Board." Emily thought about the organizational chart. She thought about the 17 complaints that had been routed into a dead end instead of reviewed. 41 people total, and most of them veterans, and most of them she knew the profile. People who had come home and tried to rebuild something and then gotten caught in a system that treated them as targets rather than citizens. She thought about Cross standing over her in the parking lot of Route 9 at nearly 1 in the morning, that particular smile. "Nobody's coming to save you." "What do you need from me today?" she asked. "Your formal statement," Rourke said. "Walkthrough of the stop, your observations, your assessment of intent. And then there's one more thing." She exchanged a glance with Ferris. "Danny Reyes has been asking to speak with you directly." Emily looked up from the folder. "With me." "He said," Rourke paused, choosing words. "He said he wants to tell you something before he tells us. I don't know exactly what that means. You don't have to agree to it." Emily considered this. A 24-year-old cop who had been watching his partner operate for 8 months and had come in early this morning and sat in a parking lot waiting for federal vehicles to arrive. That was not the behavior of someone who had made peace with his choices. That was the behavior of someone who had been carrying something and was ready to put it down. I'll talk to him, she said. Room 3 was at the far end of the second-floor corridor, past the evidence log station and the supervisor's office, a room used mostly for witness interviews that was decorated with the visual warmth of a utility closet. Danny Reyes was sitting at the table when Emily came in. He was in uniform, which struck her as an odd detail. He'd come in uniform, come in prepared to work a shift, and then gone to the parking lot to wait for the federal vehicles instead. He was very young. She'd known that from the file, but files didn't prepare you for the specific quality of someone who was young, in the middle of a thing they hadn't fully understood when they started. He had dark circles under his eyes that suggested he hadn't slept any better than she had, and his hands were on the table and very still in the way hands get when their owner is working hard to project calm. He looked up when she came in. He looked at the scrubs, the badge still clipped to her chest, her Westbrook medical badge. She'd been wearing it when Cross stopped her, and then he looked at her face. "You're a nurse," he said. "I'm a lot of things," Emily said. She sat down across from him. "What did you want to tell me?" Reyes looked at the table. He was quiet for long enough that she considered prompting him, then decided not to. Sometimes the pause was the point. "I was there," he said finally. "Not last night. I mean, 2 of the other stops. Earlier ones. Before me and Cross were officially partners, he took me along on 2 occasions where he said it was training." He looked up. "I didn't plant anything. I just stood there." "I know," Emily said. I told myself I'd misread what I saw. Because the alternative," he stopped. "Because the alternative meant making a very hard decision," she said. "I made the wrong one." She looked at him. "You're making a different one now." "I came in this morning and I didn't know what I was going to do." His jaw was working slightly. "And then I saw those vehicles pull up and I thought, if I wait, if I go upstairs and clock in and pretend I don't know anything, there's a version of this where I spend the rest of my career knowing what I know." He looked at his hands. "I couldn't do it." Emily was quiet for a moment. She thought about what Ferris had said about environment, about systems that produce people like Cross by treating certain behaviors as invisible until they weren't, about young officers who stood on dark shoulders and didn't say anything because the cost of saying something had seemed, at the time, too high. "The people you saw him do this to," she said, "do you remember anything that could help us identify them?" Reyes looked up, and then, for the next 22 minutes, he talked. He remembered more than she had expected. License plate fragments, rough dates, the locations of both stops, which were on routes she could cross-reference against the surveillance deployment map. He described the profile Cross had explicitly articulated to him, who to look for, what made a stop low risk in Cross's assessment, how to read a situation before initiating. He repeated specific phrases Cross had used. Emily listened without interrupting. When he finished, she asked 3 follow-up questions, got 3 answers, and then said, "Okay, thank you." And she meant it without performance. "Is that going to be enough?" Reyes asked, "combined with everything else?" "Yes." She stood. "You need to go give that full statement to Agent Rourke now. All of it, exactly like you told me. Don't edit, don't minimize. Just tell it straight." "What happens to me?" She met his eyes. "I don't know," she said. "That's an honest answer. You stood by during 2 incidents and didn't report them. That has consequences." "I'm not going to tell you, it doesn't." She paused. "But you came in early this morning and you sat in a parking lot and you waited. That also has consequences. How it balances out isn't my call." Reyes nodded once, slowly. She left him there and went back into the corridor. By 10 o'clock that morning, Fairmont City PD headquarters had the specific energy of a building that didn't know what it was yet. The officers on duty moved through their routines with the slightly too deliberate quality of people performing normalcy under observation. There were federal agents at 3 different points in the building. The evidence room had been sealed pending review. Lieutenant Yates had been in a closed-door meeting since 8:30, and the 2 officers who had tried to leave for patrol at 9 had been politely asked to remain on premises. The morning briefing that Yates had expected to run had not taken place. In its place, At 11:15, Rourke assembled the on-duty staff in the main briefing room. Not all of them, the ones whose names appeared on Ferris's organizational chart, had been individually asked to speak with federal investigators first. The ones who remained were, as far as the current evidence indicated, uninvolved. They stood or sat in the briefing room with varying degrees of unease, and Rourke stood at the front of the room and told them, in careful and direct language, what had happened. She told them about the 18-month complaint pattern. She told them about the surveillance operation. She told them that Officer Brandon Cross had been arrested that morning on charges including evidence tampering, civil rights violations, and conspiracy. She told them that the investigation was ongoing and that additional actions were possible. She did not tell them everything. There were things that couldn't be disclosed at this stage, but she told them enough. The room was very quiet by the time she finished. One of the officers near the back, a woman Emily didn't recognize, maybe 10 years on the job, raised her hand. Rourke nodded at her. "The complaints," the officer said. "The ones that got filed and disappeared. Are those people? Are we going to find out who they were?" "That's part of what the investigation will establish, yes," Rourke said. The officer nodded. She didn't say anything else, but the question had been asked in a tone that told Emily, standing near the wall at the back of the room, something about the culture of this department that the complaint statistics alone hadn't told her. Not everyone here had known. Not everyone had participated. Some of them had just been working, the way people work, in a system that was doing something they hadn't seen clearly. That made it better and worse at the same time. Emily leaned against the back wall and looked at the faces in the room. The ones who were angry, the ones who were frightened. The one near the middle who was doing the math and whose expression suggested the math was not coming out in a comfortable direction. She had seen this before. Not exactly this, but this shape. The moment when an institution realizes what it has been. The moment before the hard work of deciding what it becomes next. She was thinking about all 41 complaints. She was thinking about the ones who had filed them and received nothing in return and eventually stopped expecting anything different, and what that cost, accumulated over months and years, in the specific currency of trust. She was thinking about this when Ferris found her in the corridor after the briefing and pulled her aside with an expression that said the morning had developed a new complication. "We've got a problem," he said. "What kind?" "The complaint routing protocol," he said. "We've been assuming it was informal, a supervisor making case-by-case calls to bury certain reports." He paused. "It wasn't informal. There's a written policy, an internal directive dated 3 years and 8 months ago, signed and distributed to division supervisors. It establishes a specific category called Community Relations Adjustment, and it defines, in procedural language, exactly what kind of complaints get classified that way." Emily looked at him. "Who signed it?" Ferris held her gaze. Deputy Chief Leonard Wick. The name didn't mean anything to her personally, but the rank did. The rank meant that what had seemed 24 hours ago like one officer on a dark road had become by 11 in the morning something that reached the second highest position in this police department. "Does Rourke know?" Emily asked. "I just came from her. The warrants for Wick's records are going through in the next hour." He paused. "This is a bigger case than we originally modeled." Emily looked at the wall of the corridor for a moment. She was calculating something, not consciously, just the way her mind had been trained to work through threat assessments. What changed, what the new parameters meant, what the next necessary step was. "The 41 complainants," she said. "We need to start locating them today, before this gets out through media channels. They deserve to hear from us first." Ferris nodded. "Agreed. I'll coordinate with the victim's advocacy liaison." He started to turn away, then stopped. "For what it's worth, and I know you've been up for 30 hours, so maybe this isn't the moment. What you did last night, staying clean through that stop, not escalating, letting the footage do its job, that wasn't nothing. A lot of people in your position would have—" "I know what they would have done," Emily said. "I made the choice that made the case. I know. I'm just saying it was the right call." She looked at him with the expression of someone who was too tired for ceremony. "You should probably get those warrants moving," she said. He went. She stood alone in the corridor for a moment. Through the window at the far end, she could see the parking lot. The federal SUVs were still there. Across the lot, 2 local news vans had appeared in the last 40 minutes, drawn by scanner traffic or tips or the particular instinct of people who covered this beat for long enough to recognize when something was different. Her phone had been returned to her an hour ago. She'd turned it on to find 19 messages, most of them from colleagues at Westbrook, several from a number she didn't recognize, and one from Marcus Webb that said simply, "I made some calls. You're not handling this alone. Call me when you can." She hadn't called back yet. She wasn't ready for the warmth of it. Not yet. Not while she was still in the middle. She looked at the news vans. She thought about Deputy Chief Leonard Wick, sitting somewhere in this building or in his office or in his house, not yet aware that a warrant was being processed for his records, not yet aware that a policy he had signed 3 years and 8 months ago was about to be the most important document in a federal investigation. She thought about the moment, which was coming, when the size of what had been running in this city would become visible to the people who lived in it. And she thought about the 41 people who had filed complaints and been told, in the antiseptic language of bureaucratic procedure, that their experiences did not merit review. Some of them were still here. Some of them had left. Some of them had probably stopped trusting institutions in the way that once started is very hard to reverse. They were going to get a phone call today. A real one, from a federal investigator, telling them something they had stopped expecting to hear. She didn't know what that would mean to each of them specifically, but she knew what it would mean to have had something done to you and been told it didn't happen. And then to find out that someone had been watching, that the evidence existed, that the record was not what the system had told you it was. She put her phone in her jacket pocket. She had a formal statement to give. She had 41 names to help locate. She had a building full of people whose Tuesday had become something entirely different from what they'd expected, and most of them weren't handling it as cleanly as the situation required. She was exhausted in a way that was past the point of feeling like anything specific, past the point of hunger or frustration or the particular ache that comes from sitting on a metal bench for 8 hours. But she had one more thing to do before she sat down with Rourke and gave the formal statement. She found Yates in the corridor outside his office. He was standing against the wall with his arms crossed and the look of a man whose morning had become a type of event he'd trained for but hoped never to experience. "Lieutenant," she said. He turned. Looked at her the way people were going to be looking at her for the next few weeks, she suspected, with the slightly unfocused attention of someone trying to recalibrate their understanding of who they were looking at. "Miss Parker," he said. "The 2 officers who asked to go out on patrol this morning and were asked to stay," she said. "They're going to need to know why at some point. They're not on the list of people Ferris is looking at. They're just standing there not knowing." Yates looked at her. "I'll talk to them." "Good." She paused. "And the complaint routing policy. The Community Relations Adjustment Directive. How many supervisors in this building received that document?" Yates's face changed, just slightly, just enough to tell her he knew what she was asking and what it meant. "I don't know," he said. "Did you receive it?" A long pause, long enough that the answer was already in the pause before he spoke it. "Yes," he said. Emily looked at him for a moment. "Then you're going to need to have a conversation with Agent Rourke," she said, "and I'd recommend having it before she comes to you." She left him standing there and walked back toward the interview rooms. Behind her, after a moment, she heard his footsteps start moving. Not toward the exit, toward the briefing room. It wasn't much. In the context of everything this case had become in the last 12 hours, it was a very small thing, but it was something. She turned the corner and almost walked directly into a man she hadn't expected to see inside this building. He was in his mid-50s, heavy through the chest, wearing a suit that was slightly too formal for a normal Tuesday morning. And he was accompanied by a man carrying a briefcase who had attorney written so plainly in his posture that he might as well have worn a sign. The man in the suit looked at Emily. His eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. His name was on the organizational chart, second from the top. Deputy Chief Leonard Wick had not waited for the warrant to be processed. He had come in on his own, with his own lawyer, and he was looking at the nurse in the rumpled scrubs in the middle of his department's corridor with an expression that was trying to be dismissive and not quite getting there, because she was looking back at him with the patient, specific attention of someone who had already cataloged him as a problem with a known solution. "Ma'am," Wick said in the tone of someone who wanted her to move out of his way. Emily didn't move out of his way. "Deputy Chief," she said. He stopped. His lawyer put a hand on his arm. "Agent Rourke is in the briefing room," Emily said, and then she stepped to the side of the corridor and watched him walk past. She watched him until he turned the corner. She watched the briefcase-carrying attorney who followed him. She watched the corner of the corridor after they'd both gone around it. Then she took a slow breath through her nose. The case had just grown again. Leonard Wick's attorney was named Garrett Poole, and within 4 minutes of entering the briefing room, he had established 3 things: that his client was present voluntarily, that his client would not be answering questions without prior review of any materials the federal investigators intended to reference, and that his client wished to express his full cooperation with any legitimate inquiry into departmental procedures. Rourke had listened to all of this without expression. Then she had said, "Mr. Poole, your client signed a written directive on October 14th, 3 years and 8 months ago, establishing a complaint classification system that systematically prevented civilian oversight review of misconduct allegations. We have the original document, the distribution records, and the acknowledgement signatures from 11 division supervisors. So when you say legitimate inquiry, I want to make sure we have a shared understanding of what we're talking about." Poole had asked for 30 minutes with his client. Rourke had given him 20. Emily was not in the room for any of this. She was down the hall giving her formal statement to a different investigator, a methodical woman named Priya Okafor, who asked questions in precise sequence and wrote everything longhand in addition to recording it, which Emily respected. She walked through the stop from the beginning. She described the timing, the light angles, the absence of a K9 unit, the specific motion of Cross's hand. She described her decision-making in real time, why she hadn't resisted, what she'd assessed about the camera infrastructure, what she'd understood about the evidentiary value of her own compliance. Okafor asked good follow-up questions and didn't editorialize, which made the whole thing move faster than these things usually did. When they finished, Emily looked at the recorder on the table. "Is that everything?" "For now," Okafor said. "We may need a supplemental interview once we've reviewed the additional evidence." "That's fine." Emily stood. Her back hurt in the specific way that came from sitting on hard surfaces for too many hours. "The veterans in the complaint pool, have you started locating them?" "The victims advocacy team is working the list now. We've reached 9 so far." "How are they taking it?" Okafor paused in a way that was its own answer. "It's a range," she said. Emily nodded. She could imagine the range. She had once filed a complaint herself in a different context through a different institution, and she knew the specific quality of the silence that follows when nothing happens. She knew what it did to a person's relationship with the idea of reporting, the idea of accountability, the idea that the system was designed to function rather than to protect itself. She thanked Okafor and went into the corridor. The morning had moved into early afternoon. The news vans in the parking lot had multiplied, 4 now, with a 5th pulling in as Emily watched through the window at the end of the hall. Word was moving faster than the department could manage it, which was predictable. An officer arrested at his own headquarters, federal investigators, military vehicles, a sealed evidence room. That combination moved through a city's information network at a speed that press releases couldn't keep up with. Ferris found her at the window. "Wick's attorney is asking for immunity in exchange for full cooperation on the directive's origins." Emily turned from the window. "He's saying he didn't originate it. He's saying the directive was handed to him as an already written policy document, and he was told to implement it. He claims he has documentation to that effect." "Documentation from whom?" Ferris's expression said, "That's the part." "He's saying it came from the city attorney's office," Ferris said. "Specifically from a deputy city attorney named Norris Beaumont, who retired 14 months ago." Emily was quiet. "If that's accurate," Ferris continued, "we're looking at a policy that originated outside the department, which means the suppression framework wasn't a rogue supervisor making independent calls. It was designed," Emily said. "Potentially. We're pulling Beaumont's records. He's not reachable yet. Apparently he's out of state." Ferris paused. "Rourke is managing it, but I wanted you to know the scope is still expanding." She looked at the parking lot. The 5th news van had parked. A reporter was doing a standing piece near the department's main entrance with the building as a backdrop, and the combination of the federal vehicles and the sealed entrance gave the shot exactly the visual weight she was probably hoping for. Emily had been awake for approximately 32 hours. Her body had moved past the phase of active fatigue and into the strange lucidity that comes after. Everything slightly too clear, edges too sharp, a mild unreality to the physical world that she recognized and knew how to work with because she had operated in this state before under conditions that didn't allow for rest. She thought about the complaint that had started this. Not her arrest, that had been the mechanism, the event that created the evidentiary opportunity. She thought about the veteran whose complaint had been the 23rd filed. A man named Darius Holt, 43 years old, 2 tours, discharged honorably, who had been pulled over on a Saturday afternoon 3 months ago and found himself standing on a sidewalk while Cross searched his vehicle without consent, found nothing, and then cited him for a broken taillight that Holt had documentation proving was replaced 2 weeks prior. The citation had been filed. The complaint Holt subsequently filed had been classified as community relations adjustment and had gone nowhere. Holt was the reason the federal program had flagged Fairmont City specifically. His complaint had contained a detail, a procedural description of how the stop was conducted, that matched the language of 2 previous complaints from veterans in the same district, same officer. The pattern had been visible if you were looking for it. Nobody locally had been looking for it. Emily had read Holt's file 3 weeks ago as part of her program orientation to this assignment. She had read it with the particular attention she gave to things that mattered before she understood exactly why they mattered. She was thinking about him when her phone rang. The number was Westbrook Medical. She answered. "Emily?" It was Gerald Kwan's voice, and it had a quality she hadn't heard from him before, something tight underneath the professional tone. "I'm glad you picked up. Where are you?" "At the department. I gave my statement this morning." Okay, good." A pause. "I need to tell you something, and I'm telling you because I think you should hear it from someone who isn't a stranger. Dr. Ferris called HR this morning." Emily straightened slightly. "Pauline Ferris. She's asking them to expedite the suspension review. She said she's seen enough of the news coverage to understand the situation has changed, and she wants the hospital's position to be clear before—" He stopped. "Before it becomes a story." Emily kept her voice even. "And what is the hospital's position?" "I think the position is going to be that they moved too fast," Kwan said, in the careful tone of a man who was being as honest as he could without saying more than he should. "I think that's what it's going to look like when they issue a statement. Moved too fast, made a decision without sufficient information, deeply regret any—" He stopped again. "Emily, I'm sorry. When I heard about the arrest, I should have called someone before it got to Ferris's desk. I should have said something." She was quiet for a moment. "You're saying it now," she said. That's not the same thing." "No," she said. "It isn't, but it's something." She watched the reporter outside finish her piece and lower her microphone. "Gerald, go do your job. I'll deal with Westbrook when I deal with it." She ended the call. The anger she felt was not sharp. It was slow and dense, the kind that settles into the chest rather than burning through it, and she recognized it as something she would need to process at a point when processing was possible. Not now. Now she put the phone back in her pocket and turned from the window and walked back toward the briefing room, because there was more to do, and the things that needed doing would not wait for her to feel better about any of this. At 2:17 in the afternoon, the situation changed again. It changed because of a phone call to the Federal Operations Line from a number registered to a prepaid phone in a motel 12 miles outside Fairmont City. The caller identified himself as a former FCPD officer named Walt Pruitt, who had been on the force for 11 years before retiring 4 years ago, which put his retirement inside the window of the directive's implementation. Pruitt told the agent who took the call that he had documentation. Physical documentation, not digital, not stored on a system that could be accessed remotely. He said he had held on to it because he hadn't known what to do with it and had been afraid to do anything with it, and he had seen the morning's news coverage and made a decision. He said he had a written record of a meeting that predated the directive. A meeting he had attended at which the complaint suppression approach had been discussed and approved by a group of people that included names he was prepared to provide. Names that went beyond WIC, beyond the department, beyond the city attorney's office. The agent who took the call immediately escalated it to Rourke, who came out of the WIC meeting in the middle of Poole's second attempt at framing an immunity arrangement and said 3 words to the junior agent who found her: "Get me Ferris." Emily heard about the call 6 minutes later from Ferris in the corridor, in the abbreviated way that information gets transmitted when everyone involved understands there is no time for full sentences. "Who else is on the list?" she asked. Ferris looked at her steadily. "He wouldn't say over the phone. He'll only do it in person. We're sending 2 agents to the motel now." A pause. "He mentioned a judge." The word landed in the corridor between them. Emily absorbed it. A judge. Which meant the complaint suppression hadn't only been about preventing review within the department. It had been about ensuring that anything which did escape the department's internal filter would encounter a second filter, a judicial one, before it could become a legal problem for anyone who needed it not to. 41 complaints. Routed away. Rerouted again. And somewhere in that architecture, a judge whose name Pruitt had been sitting on for 4 years in a motel room 12 miles outside the city. "How long until your agents get there?" Emily asked. 20 minutes. "And Pruitt? Does he seem credible?" Ferris considered the question with the care it deserved. He knew Wick's name before we mentioned it. He knew the directive's approximate date. He knew the specific classification terminology. He paused. "Yeah, he seems credible." Emily nodded once. Ferris's phone buzzed. He looked at it, and his expression shifted. Not alarm, but the controlled concentration of someone who has just received information that requires immediate action. "What?" Emily said. He looked up from the phone. "Pruitt just called back. He says someone's outside the motel." Ferris was already moving before he finished the sentence. Emily followed him into the command space they'd set up in the department's secondary conference room. 2 laptops, a secure communications line, a whiteboard that had stopped being about patrol assignments hours ago. Rourke was already on the phone, her voice low and clipped, the specific register of someone issuing instructions to people in motion. "How far out are the agents?" Ferris said. Rourke held up 4 fingers without looking at him. 4 minutes. "What did Pruitt say exactly?" Emily asked the junior agent at the laptop, a woman named Torres who had been running communications all morning with the focused efficiency of someone who understood that her job right now was to be invisible and accurate. He said a car pulled into the lot about 3 minutes after his second call, parked facing his unit, didn't get out. Torres pulled up the call log on her screen. He said the car wasn't there when he checked in last night. He checked in under a different name. "So someone knew where to look," Emily said. "That's what he thinks." Rourke ended her call. "The agents are diverting to approach from the rear access road. I've got local sheriff's deputies on the way as backup, but they're 7 minutes out." She looked at the whiteboard, at the names written there, at the lines drawn between them. If Pruitt's documentation is real and someone from this network found him, that means someone in this building, or connected to someone in this building, made a call in the last 2 hours. The room absorbed this. "We have a leak," Ferris said. "We have a possibility of a leak," Rourke said, "which is different, but we're operating like it's confirmed until we know otherwise." She looked at Torres. "Lock the communications log. Nobody in or out of this network except primary team." Torres was already typing. Emily stood near the whiteboard and looked at the names. Wick, Cross. And above them, connected by a line drawn in red marker, a name written with a question mark beside it. Beaumont. Nen. Retired. And beside that, written in smaller letters because it had only been added in the last hour, Judge, unconfirmed/Pruitt. A judge. Who was it? She ran through what she knew about Fairmont City's judicial structure. Circuit Court, 3 sitting judges, 2 who had been on the bench long enough to overlap with the directive's implementation date. She didn't know enough to narrow it further, and she knew that speculating without data was the kind of thing that created mistakes. So she stopped. She watched the laptop screen instead, where Torres had pulled up a satellite view of the motel. Single story, 12 units, exterior corridor, parking lot visible from the road. The car Pruitt had described was on the south end of the lot, 2 spaces from his unit. At 2:31 p.m., the federal agent's vehicle appeared on the access road behind the motel property. At 2:33, the car in the south lot pulled out and left. Torres tracked it on the satellite feed until it turned onto the main road and disappeared from the camera's range. She got a partial plate, 4 characters, possible state, no confirmation. She ran it anyway. Rourke's phone buzzed. She read the message. Agents are with Pruitt. He's unharmed. The room let out a collective breath that nobody had acknowledged holding. The documents, Ferris said. They're bringing him in. Him and everything he has. Rourke set the phone on the table. Whoever was in that parking lot, they either knew we'd get there first or they weren't there to do anything physical. They were there to send a message. To Pruitt, Emily said. Yes. Which means someone knows he exists and knows he has something worth finding. She paused. Which means whoever it is has been watching this case move faster than they expected, and they're trying to close gaps. The partial plate came back from Torres with 2 possible registered vehicles, one of which was a rental. The rental had been processed at an agency 40 minutes from Fairmont City at 8 that morning, 2 hours after Cross's arrest had gone out over the scanner. Rourke took the printout from Torres, looked at it, and said nothing for a moment. Then she picked up her phone and made another call. Emily turned away from the screen. She was thinking about the shape of what they were dealing with now. Not an individual corrupt officer, not even a corrupt department. A system with enough reach to know, within hours of the morning's events, that a retired cop in a motel 12 miles away had documentation. Enough reach to put a car in his parking lot before the federal team could get there. Enough reach that the question was no longer who had done wrong, but how deeply the structure of doing wrong had been built into the ordinary operation of this city. That was a different problem than the one she'd started with on the shoulder of Route 9. Walt Pruitt arrived at the department at 3:44 p.m. in the back of a federal vehicle, accompanied by 2 agents and carrying a canvas messenger bag that he held against his body with both arms the entire ride, the way a person holds something they've been afraid to put down for a long time. He was 61 years old, retired 4 years, carrying the particular physical quality of a man who had spent decades doing a job that required him to be physically imposing and had then stopped, so that the structure was still there underneath, but the edges had softened. His face was tired. He had the eyes of someone who had been making a decision for 4 years and had finally made it that morning and wasn't entirely sure he'd survive what came next. Emily was not in the room when he came in. She was down the hall, washing her face in the restroom sink with cold water, which was the closest thing to a reset available to her. She looked at herself in the mirror for a moment. The scrubs, the hair, the specific texture of a face that had been awake for 34 hours. She thought about the burn patient from the previous night and whether the wound protocol had been updated. She thought about things that had nothing to do with this building for approximately 90 seconds, because she had learned that the mind needs somewhere to put itself that is not the crisis, even briefly, if it is going to keep functioning clearly in the crisis. Then she dried her face and went back to work. Ferris met her in the corridor. "You need to see this." She followed him into the secondary conference room where Pruitt's documents were being laid out on the table by Torres, with gloved hands and a digital camera documenting each piece before it was touched. The documents were physical: printed pages, some handwritten notes, a series of photographs of what appeared to be meeting agendas. Pruitt had folded some of them so many times the paper had gone soft along the creases. Emily stood at the edge of the table and looked at the spread. The meeting agendas were dated 4 years and 2 months ago, 6 weeks before the written directive that Wick had signed. The agendas listed attendees. She scanned them quickly, the way she scanned intake notes in the ER, looking for the thing that mattered fastest. The name at the top of the attendee list, listed as facilitator, was not Wick. It was not Beaumont. It was the Honorable Raymond Stahl, Circuit Court Judge, 3rd District, Fairmont City. Emily looked at the name for a moment. Then she looked at Ferris. "He ran the meeting," she said. "According to this, he ran 3 of them," Ferris said. "Pruitt attended 1. He took handwritten notes. He photographed the agenda before he left because he had a feeling he'd need to have been there." Ferris paused. He said it took him a week to understand what he'd witnessed, and then he didn't know who to tell because everyone he might have told was in the room. Emily looked at Judge Raymond Stahl's name on the agenda. 3rd District. She knew, from the veterans in the complaint pool, that at least 9 of the 41 complainants had subsequently attempted to file civil suits and had been dismissed at the preliminary stage. She did not know which judge had presided. She was going to find out in the next 20 minutes, and she already knew what the answer was going to be. "Where's Pruitt now?" she asked. "Talking to Rourke." Ferris looked at the documents on the table. He said the night he photographed that agenda, he went home and sat in his kitchen until 4 in the morning thinking about what it meant. He said he almost turned it in 6 different times. He paused. He said the thing that kept stopping him was that he didn't think anyone would believe him without corroboration, and he didn't know where corroboration would come from. "It came from Route 9, Emily said. "Yeah." He looked at her. "It came from Route 9. She straightened up from the table. Her back ached. Her eyes felt like they had sand in them. "I need the civil case records for all 41 complainants. Everything that made it to any kind of court filing. I need it cross-referenced against Stahl's docket." "I'll have Torres pull it," Ferris said. "And I need to know who made the call about the rental car. Who knew Pruitt's location 2 hours after the arrest?" "We're working that. The rental agency footage is being pulled now." He paused. "Emily, you've been up since before your shift yesterday." "I know. There's a point where being tired becomes a liability." She looked at him with the expression of someone who had been told this before, in worse circumstances, by people with more authority to say it. "Get me the case records," she said. "I'll sleep when Stahl is in handcuffs." He didn't argue further. He went. The civil case records took 40 minutes to compile and cross-reference, because the system they were pulling from was the department's own records interface, and it was not designed for the kind of lateral search Torres was running. While she waited, Emily sat in the corner of the conference room with a cup of coffee she didn't taste and her phone and called Marcus Webb. He answered on the second ring. "Emily, where are you?" "Still at the department. I'm okay." She paused. "Thank you for the message, and for calling whoever you called." "I called Jim Beretta. He's a good attorney. He's been trying to reach you all morning." "I'll call him." She looked at the document still spread on the table. "The hospital? Ferris is moving on the suspension?" "Pauline sent an email to the department head an hour ago. I saw a copy." His voice had a careful quality. "The language is, it's political, Emily. It's written to protect the hospital's position, but the outcome is going to be what it needs to be." "As long as the outcome is correct, the language can be whatever it needs to be," she said. A pause. "How are you actually doing?" She considered the question with more honesty than she gave most things. "I'm tired. There are more people involved in this than I understood going in, and each additional person means more time before it's done. And I'm aware that every hour this stays open is another hour the people who did wrong to 41 veterans have not yet been held accountable." She paused. "I'm doing what needs doing." "That's not quite what I asked." "I know." She looked at the window. The parking lot outside was fully chaotic now, but 6 news vans, a cluster of people near the entrance who were probably a mix of reporters and concerned citizens, and the particular type of person who shows up at civic crises because they need to be near the thing that's happening. "I'll call you when I have more. Tell the ER I'll be in touch about my schedule." "Don't worry about the schedule." "I always worry about the schedule, Marcus." "Someone has to." She ended the call before he could respond to that because she could hear the warmth in his voice building towards something she wasn't ready to receive. Torres called from across the room. "I've got the cross-reference." Emily crossed to the screen. Of the 41 complainants, 14 had filed some form of civil or administrative action subsequent to their complaint being classified as resolved. Of those 14, 11 had appeared before Judge Raymond Stahl at the preliminary stage. Of those 11, all 11 had been dismissed. The 12th, 13th, and 14th cases had been before a different judge and had proceeded. 2 of them settling out of court at amounts that suggested the city had decided it was cheaper to pay than to litigate. All 11 Stahl dismissals had been filed within the same 18-month window as the directive. All 11 had been dismissed on identical procedural grounds. A specific ruling about insufficient evidence of systematic conduct, which was a standard that Stahl had applied with a consistency that was statistically implausible if it were genuinely case-by-case analysis. Emily looked at the pattern for a long time. He wasn't just suppressing complaints, she said. He was providing judicial cover for the cases that survived the first filter. Anyone who got through the department's internal system still hit him on the other end. Belt and suspenders, Torres said quietly. Yeah. Emily straightened. Where's Rourke? Brosant. Rourke was finishing her interview with Pruitt when Emily knocked and entered. Pruitt looked up. He looked at her the way people had been looking at her all day. The recalibration, the scrubs, the badge. But in his case, it had a different quality, something more like recognition. You're the nurse, he said, from the arrest. Yes. He looked at her for another moment. I watched the clip they showed on the news, the one from the traffic camera. He shook his head slowly. You just stood there. I knew the camera was there, Emily said. Roughly. You knew. He processed this. So you let him do it. I let him document himself doing it, she said. There's a difference. Pruitt was quiet for a moment. I should have done something 4 years ago, he said. What I had wasn't the camera footage. It wasn't airtight, but it was something, and He stopped. You were one person with an incomplete picture and no institutional support, Emily said. That's not an excuse, but it's a reason. He looked at her with the expression of a man who had been preparing to be told he was a coward and had been told something more complicated instead and wasn't sure what to do with the complexity. The people on that list, he said, the ones they stopped, planted on, whatever they did. Are they going to be okay? They're going to be found, Emily said, and then we'll see. Rourke caught Emily's eye across the table and gave a small nod that said, later. Emily gave one back that said, soon. She left them and went back into the corridor. At 4:52 p.m., federal agents arrived at Judge Raymond Stahl's chambers at the Fairmont City Courthouse with a warrant for his case records, his communications, and his personal files. The warrant had been processed in 90 minutes. Rourke had been building toward it for the last 2 hours, and Pruitt's documents had provided the probable cause that locked it. Stahl was in session when the agents arrived. They waited outside the courtroom. When he emerged 20 minutes later, he saw them in the corridor and stopped walking. Emily was not there for this. She was at the department, reading the case records Torres had pulled. But Ferris was there, and he would tell her afterward that Stahl's expression, in the moment he saw the agents and understood what they were holding, was unlike anything he'd seen on a man's face in a professional context. Not guilt, not fear exactly. More like the expression of someone who has been carrying a very heavy thing for a very long time and has finally been told they can put it down, except that putting it down means something that is not relief. Stahl's attorney was called. The warrant was executed. The agents left with 3 boxes of files and a hard drive from Stahl's chambers that his clerk, a young woman who had worked for him for 8 months and who would later say she had noticed things she hadn't known how to name, produced without being asked twice. Cross had been in a holding room at the federal building since mid-morning. His attorney, not a public defender, a private one he'd called himself, which told Emily something about his financial situation that she filed away without particular interest, had arrived at 11 and had been engaged in the specific activity of managing expectations ever since. At 5:30 p.m., Cross was walked from the holding room to a formal interview space for a second round of questioning. Rourke conducted it herself this time. She put the footage on the screen again. She put Pruitt's documents on the table. She put the case record cross-reference in front of his attorney and let him read it for 90 seconds. Then she said, "We're going to talk about the other stops, not the Parker arrest. That case is made. I want to talk about the pattern, and I want to know who gave you the confidence that this approach was sustainable." Cross's attorney leaned in and said something in his ear. Cross looked at the documents on the table. He looked at the footage on the screen. He looked like a man doing arithmetic in his head, the kind where you keep running the calculation hoping the number will change, and it doesn't. "I want a deal," Cross said. "Tell me something worth dealing for," Rourke said. Another murmured exchange with the attorney, a pause that stretched long enough to be its own kind of answer. "Wick came to me," Cross said finally, "before I did any of this. He came to me and explained how things worked in this district, what was tolerated, what the expectation was." He paused. "He said the judge handled anything that got past the internal review. He said it was a closed loop. He said as long as I stayed consistent with the profile, nothing would come back. The profile, Rourke said. Veterans. Specifically veterans who'd filed previous complaints. He said the algorithm for who was a safe target was worked out, that it had been tested. Cross's jaw worked. I knew it was wrong. I want to be clear, I'm not saying I didn't know. I appreciate that, Rourke said. I'd like you to continue. Cross talked for 53 minutes. He gave names, dates, locations. He described 4 other officers he'd seen operating with the same approach. He described 2 separate occasions when Wick had explicitly referenced Stahl's courtroom as a backstop. He described a conversation 6 months into his time on the force when a supervisor whose name was not Wick, but was one of the 11 signatures on the directive distribution list, had taken him aside after a stop and said, in words he remembered precisely, "Don't worry about complaints. Complaints go away." The interview was recorded. Every word. At 7:15 p.m., when it was done and Cross had been returned to holding, Rourke came out into the corridor where Emily was waiting and handed her a printout of the 4 additional officer names Cross had provided. Emily looked at the list. She recognized none of them personally. She looked at the distribution of their assignment areas across the city, and she understood, without needing it explained, that the coverage was not accidental. The 4 officers were spread across the 3 northern districts that contained the highest concentration of veteran-occupied housing. This was a targeted operation, she said. Against a specific demographic, yes, Rourke said. She looked tired for the first time all day. Not impaired, just tired. The way people who do this work look at the end of the day when the work has been real. Cross isn't the origin. He's not even close to the origin. He's the street-level implementation of something that was built by people who understood exactly what they were building. Beaumont, Emily said. We located him. He's in Arizona. He's not going anywhere. His passport was flagged this afternoon. Rourke paused. He hasn't lawyered up yet. That's either very confident or very stupid. Probably both, Emily said. Rourke almost smiled. Probably. She looked at the printout in Emily's hand. The 4 additional officers are being brought in for questioning tonight. The warrant for Stahl's assets is being processed. If there's financial connection between him and the others, we'll find it in the next 72 hours. She paused. The Westbrook situation. Ferris spoke with their legal counsel this afternoon. The suspension review is being expedited. You'll have something in writing by tomorrow morning. Emily folded the printout and put it in her jacket pocket. What's the timeline for the 41? We've reached 26. The others, some of them have moved, some of them have disconnected numbers. We'll get there. Rourke studied her for a moment. You should sleep, Emily. We have this. The pieces are moving. I know they're moving, Emily said. I just want to make sure they're moving in the right order. It was the most personal thing she'd said all day, and she was tired enough that she didn't catch it until it was out. Rourke heard it, she could tell, heard the thing underneath it. Not control exactly, but the particular investment of someone who had not just been a mechanism in this operation, but had been the mechanism, and who needed to see the structure hold before she could trust it to hold without her. Go sit somewhere for an hour, Rourke said, not unkindly. We'll come get you if something breaks. Emily went. She found the small room off the main corridor again, the one with the table and the chairs and the coffee machine, and she sat down and put her head back against the wall and closed her eyes. She didn't sleep. She ran through the sequence instead, the names, the connections, the documents on the table, the footage on the screen. She ran through what was confirmed and what was still moving and what the remaining gaps were. At 8:40 p.m., Torres knocked on the door. Emily opened her eyes. The rental car, Torres said. We got the agency footage. Emily stood. And? Torres hesitated for exactly 1 second, which was 1 second longer than she usually hesitated, and Emily knew from that hesitation that what came next was going to change the shape of the evening. The person who rented it, Torres said, she's a paralegal. Her employer is listed as the office of Garrett Poole. Emily was still for a moment. Garrett Poole, Wick's attorney. The man who had walked into this building that morning with his client beside him to negotiate an immunity arrangement, who had sat in the briefing room for 6 hours while the investigation developed around him, who had been present, physically present in this building, when Pruitt's location had somehow been compromised within 2 hours of the morning's events. Poole had been in the building. He had access to conversations in hallways, to the rhythm of who was being pulled into what room, to the specific urgency that had rippled through the federal team when Pruitt's first call came in. He hadn't needed a leak inside the investigation. He had been sitting inside the investigation as a defense attorney with legitimate access, with a paralegal and a rental car and a phone. Emily looked at Torres. "Where is Poole now?" she asked. "That's the thing," Torres said. "He left with Wick 2 hours ago, after Wick was formally processed. We have him on the exit log." She paused. "But his office called Wick's wife 40 minutes ago, said Poole had an emergency and was unavailable for the evening." Emily moved toward the door. "Rourke's already on it," Torres said. "But—" She stopped. "But what?" "Poole's paralegal, the one who rented the car." Torres looked at her screen, then at Emily. "She's 22 years old. She started at Poole's office 3 months ago, and her prior employment—" Torres turned the screen so Emily could see it. "She was a records clerk at the 3rd District Courthouse. Raymond Stahl's courthouse." Emily looked at the screen. She looked at the name. She looked at the dates. "The paralegal started at Poole's office," she said slowly, 3 months ago." "Yes." "Which is approximately 3 months after the federal anti-corruption program flagged Fairmont City and opened the preliminary inquiry." Torres was very still. "Someone knew we were coming," Emily said, "before we set up the cameras, before we identified the complaint pattern as an active investigation. Someone in this network knew there was federal interest in this district and moved a person into position inside a defense attorney's office that they had reason to believe would become relevant." She looked at the name on Torres's screen one more time. Then she looked at the door. Someone had been watching this investigation before it was an investigation, and that meant the list of names on Ferris's whiteboard, Wick, Cross, Beaumont, Stahl, was still not complete. She went to find Rourke. Not running. There was nothing to run toward yet, nothing that required speed over clarity, but moving with the particular directness of someone who has just had the last piece of a pattern click into place and needs to put it in front of the right person before the picture changes again. Rourke was in the main command space with Ferris, both of them on phones, both of them with the posture of people managing multiple moving things simultaneously. Emily waited 4 seconds for Rourke to finish her call, then said, "Poole's paralegal, she came from Stahl's courthouse. She was planted." Rourke looked at her. Then she looked at Ferris, who had just ended his own call. "Torres sent me the file," Rourke said. "We're already pulling her communication records." "Then you know what it means," Emily said. "It means this network had foreknowledge of federal interest in Fairmont City," Rourke said. "Yes, we're working on the source of that." She looked at the whiteboard, at the names, at the lines between them. "The most likely pathway is a contact inside the DOJ regional office. Someone who saw the preliminary inquiry flag and passed it along. That's a separate investigation. We've already notified internal affairs at the regional level." Emily absorbed this. A leak inside the oversight apparatus itself. Someone who had seen the machinery of accountability turning and had sent a warning in the other direction. She didn't ask whether Rourke had confidence it would be found. She could see from Rourke's face that Rourke was angry in the specific way that people who have devoted their careers to institutional integrity get angry when the institution fails them. Not performatively, not loudly, just a cold, focused anger that was going to persist until the answer was found. "Poole," Emily said. "Where is he?" "His car was picked up on traffic cameras 40 minutes ago heading toward the interstate. We have 2 vehicles following." Ferris looked at his phone. "He hasn't tried to leave the state, which is either because he doesn't think he needs to or because he's smarter than running." "He's smarter than running," Emily said. "He spent 6 hours in this building today watching everything develop and he didn't show a thing. He's been managing this for a while." "Which is exactly why we're not going to lose him," Rourke said, in the tone of someone stating a fact rather than expressing hope. Emily nodded. She looked at the whiteboard one more time, then she looked at Rourke. "I want to be in the room when you bring him in," she said. Rourke considered this. It was not standard. It was not, strictly speaking, appropriate. Emily was a witness and a victim in this case, not an investigator. Rourke knew all of this. "You can watch from the observation room," she said finally. "I can't put you in the interview." "Observation room is fine," Emily said. She went and sat in the small room with the cold coffee machine, and she waited. Garrett Poole was picked up at 10:23 p.m. at a restaurant 40 minutes outside Fairmont City, where he had been, apparently, having dinner with a woman who was not his paralegal and not his client, and who looked deeply surprised when federal agents appeared at the table. He came without resistance. He was polite. He asked, in a very controlled voice, whether this was really necessary, and the agent who answered said yes, it really was, and Poole straightened his jacket and came. Emily watched through the observation window as Rourke walked him through what they had: the paralegal's employment history, the rental car, the timing of the parking lot appearance relative to the communications inside the department. Poole sat with his hands folded on the table and listened to all of it with the expression of a man who had prepared for this conversation and was now executing the preparation. "You're describing coincidences," Poole said. "I'm describing a pattern," Rourke said. "My paralegal's previous employment is not my concern and not my knowledge. Her transportation choices on her personal time. Mr. Poole." Rourke slid a photograph across the table. It was a still from the rental agency's security footage, time-stamped 8:14 that morning. The paralegal, clear and identifiable, at the rental counter. "This was taken 47 minutes after your client's arrest was called in on the scanner. 47 minutes. She rented a car. She drove to the motel where Walter Pruitt was staying. She parked outside his unit." Rourke paused. "You want to tell me what that is, if it's not coordination?" Poole looked at the photograph. Something moved through his face. Not cracking, not breaking, something more controlled than that. The recalculation of someone who is very good at this and has just encountered a wall they didn't know was there. "I'd like to make a call," he said. "You can make a call," Rourke said. "But I want you to understand something first. Walter Pruitt is in protective custody. He is safe. His documents have been processed and are part of the federal record. The person you might be thinking of calling has already been detained." She let that sit for a moment. "There is no version of tonight where a phone call changes the evidentiary situation. There's only a version where you talk to us and a version where you don't, and I think you're smart enough to understand which one serves you better." Poole looked at the photograph for a long time. Then he looked at the wall behind Rourke. Then he said, "I want immunity from the conspiracy charge. Just the conspiracy charge. Everything else, I'll accept the exposure on everything else." Rourke didn't move. "Tell me why the conspiracy charge." "Because the conspiracy charge is the one that touches the person who built this," Poole said. "And that person has a longer reach than anything you've documented so far. And if I'm going to put my name on record against that person, I need to know I'm not going to be the one who ends up absorbing the full weight of it." "Who built it?" Rourke said. Poole was quiet for 4 seconds. Emily counted them through the glass. "Norris Beaumont didn't retire," Poole said. "He was moved. There's a difference. He was moved because the person who architected this needed him to have distance from the city attorney's office before the federal inquiry got close enough to create exposure. Beaumont was given a consulting arrangement, private, paid through a shell entity, doing work for a development group with significant city contracts." He paused. "The development group is owned, through 3 layers of holding companies, by a city councilman named Douglas Vare." Emily, in the observation room, went still. Douglas Vare. She knew the name. Not personally. She hadn't lived in Fairmont City long enough to know its political landscape in detail. But she'd seen it in passing, on the kind of signage that appears in cities where development money and civic politics have been married long enough to stop being embarrassed about it. Vare had been on the city council for 9 years. He sat on the Public Safety Committee. He had been, as recently as the previous year, quoted in a local profile as a strong advocate for veterans' services in the district. "Why veterans?" Emily said, though she was alone in the observation room and no one could hear her. But she already knew. She had known it from the moment the complaint pattern had first been described to her, the way it felt not random, but designed. Veterans made complicated witnesses. They had complicated relationships with institutional authority, with reporting systems, with the specific kind of trust that gets built and broken in uniform and doesn't rebuild the same way twice. They were less likely to pursue civil remedies through extended litigation. They were more likely to absorb a loss and move on because they had been trained to absorb and move on. And they were, in certain demographic concentrations, residents of neighborhoods that VAER's development group had been systematically acquiring adjacent properties to for the better part of a decade. She put her hand flat against the cold glass of the observation window. A council member. A man who had stood in front of cameras and spoken about serving veterans while running a machine designed to destabilize them, to criminalize them, to make their neighborhoods places they would eventually leave. It was not a grand conspiracy in the cinematic sense, no single orchestrating moment, no villain speech. It was what it actually was: incremental, institutional, patient. Built-in meetings with agendas and complaint routing protocols, and judicial chambers and defense attorney offices and rental cars. Built by people who understood that the most durable corruption is the kind that looks from the outside like procedure. Rourke's voice came through the observation room speaker. Douglas VAER. I have documentation, Poole said. Not with me. In a storage unit I control that is not associated with my office or my home. I will give you the location and the access code, in exchange for immunity from the conspiracy charge. He paused. I was not in the inner circle of this. I was engaged for specific legal work. I knew enough to understand what I was part of. I made choices I am not. He stopped. I am not proud of them, but I can give you the documentation that connects VAER to the financial architecture. And without that connection, everything else you have is institutional misconduct at the department level. With it, it's a criminal enterprise. Rourke looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, I'll need 30 minutes. She left the room. Emily watched Poole sit alone at the table. He put his elbows on the table and pressed his hands against his face and stayed that way for almost a minute. It wasn't performance. There was no one in the room to perform for. It was just a man at the end of something he'd been carrying, and whatever the weight of it was clearly heavier than he'd let anyone see. Emily stepped back from the glass. Rourke found her in the corridor. You heard all of it, Rourke said, not a question. Yes. Your thoughts? Emily considered this carefully. His exposure analysis is accurate. Without the financial connection to VAER, the case stops at the department level. You can convict Cross, Stahl, Wick, probably Beaumont, and the 4 additional officers. That's significant. But VAER walks. And if VAER walks, the thing that made all the others possible is still intact. Agreed. Rourke looked at the door of the interview room. The immunity arrangement will be limited in scope. He takes responsibility for the obstruction and the coordination of the parking lot incident. The conspiracy charge is reduced, not eliminated. His cooperation has to be full and complete. Any gap, any withheld document, the arrangement collapses. That's fair, Emily said. Rourke looked at her with the expression of someone who is going to say something they've been holding back. This case, what it became today, went well past what the program expected when it flagged this district. You were supposed to be background, context, a person who understood the veteran population well enough to help us read the complaint pattern. Emily said nothing. You were never supposed to be in a cell, Rourke said. I know. And you handled it. Rourke stopped. You handled it in a way that made the whole thing prosecutable. Your decision-making on that shoulder, in that cell, through the entire morning, it wasn't luck. It was training and judgment and something else that's harder to name. She paused. I've been doing this for 16 years. I don't tell witnesses that often. Emily looked at the floor for a moment. She felt the compliment land somewhere complicated. Not uncomfortable, but not simple either. Because the truth was that on the shoulder of Route 9, in the cold, with her hands behind her back and the gravel pressing through her shoes, she had not been entirely certain. She had made the calculation. She had believed in the calculation. But there is a difference between believing in a plan and knowing it will work, and anyone who tells you otherwise has never had to hold still while something was being done to them and trust that the stillness was the right choice. Thank you, she said. It came out quieter than she intended. Rourke nodded once. Go sleep somewhere. We'll execute the storage unit warrant in the morning. There's nothing you can do tonight that we can't do without you. This time, Emily didn't argue. Potek, She slept on a cot in a back room of the federal field office for 5 hours and 40 minutes, which was not enough and was also more than she'd thought she'd manage. She woke at 4:47 a.m. to the sound of voices in the corridor and lay still for a moment looking at the ceiling, running inventory the way she'd been trained. What hurt, what worked, what the status was. Everything hurt, more or less. Everything worked. The status was ongoing. She got up. The storage unit warrant was executed at 6:15 a.m. What they found there took the forensic accountants assigned to the case the better part of 3 days to fully map, but the broad shape of it was clear within the first 4 hours. A paper trail connecting Vare's development entity to shell payments that had funded Beaumont's consulting arrangement, which had in turn funded the legal infrastructure that supported the complaint suppression protocol. Not clean connections. Nothing in this kind of architecture was clean. But connections that were, in the judgment of the lead forensic accountant, documentable and prosecutable. Douglas Vare was arrested at his home at 7:52 a.m. on the third day. Emily was not there for the arrest. She was at Westbrook Medical Center, sitting across from Dr. Pauline Ferris in a meeting that had been scheduled for 30 minutes and had already gone to 45, because these things never take the time they're supposed to take. Ferris had, to her credit, said the words directly and without the insulating language of institutional correspondence. She said, "The suspension was a mistake. We moved on incomplete information under pressure we should have been better equipped to resist. I'm sorry." Emily had looked at her for a moment. "Is the apology official or personal?" Ferris blinked. "Both." "Okay," Emily said. "Then I accept both." It was not a warm moment. It was not designed to be. Emily had not come back to Westbrook for warmth. She'd come back because it was where she worked, and the work was what she cared about, and the machinery of institutional apology, however genuine, was not the thing she wanted to spend her energy on. The reinstatement paperwork was signed. Her badge access was restored. Her scheduled shifts were returned to her. She walked out of Ferris's office and into the main corridor of the hospital and stood there for a moment. The smell of the place, antiseptic and floor cleaner, and something warmer underneath, the particular human smell of a space where sick people and working people occupy the same air, was more welcome than she'd expected. She hadn't known, until she was standing in it again, how much of herself she'd left in this building. Gerald Kwan found her in the corridor within 2 minutes, which meant he'd been watching for her, which meant he cared in the way that people who are not good at expressing it directly find other ways to express it. "Parker," he said. "Kwan," she said. He looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man choosing between 3 or 4 things to say. He settled on, "You look better than you did in the photos." "What photos?" He turned his phone to show her. It was a still from a news segment, Emily in her scrubs, taken at some point outside the federal building, the kind of shot photographers get by waiting near exits. She looked tired in the photo. She looked very real. "They've been running it all day," Kwan said. "Well, since the Vare arrest." He paused. "You're not going to be anonymous for a while." She looked at the photo. She thought about anonymity and what it had given her. 3 years of just doing the work, being good at the thing, existing in a building full of people who needed her without anyone needing her to be more than what she was in the room. She had valued that. She was not sure she had valued it enough until the possibility of it had changed. "I'll manage," she said. "I know you will." He looked down the corridor. Bay 4 has a post-op who's been asking for someone to explain her discharge instructions for the 3rd time. She's not confused. She's scared. Emily looked at him. Then she looked at the corridor. "Give me 2 minutes to put my stuff in the locker," she said. She went to work. The federal trial of Brandon Cross, Leonard Wick, Raymond Stahl, Norris Beaumont, Douglas Vare, Garrett Poole, and 4 additional officers opened 11 weeks after the arrest on Route 9. It ran for 22 days. Emily testified on the 4th day. She sat in the witness chair in a courtroom that was fuller than she'd expected. Not just press, not just the legal teams and the families of the defendants and the people from the advocacy organizations who had been following the case. There were veterans in the gallery. Some of them she recognized from the list of 41. Most of them she didn't. They had come on their own from different parts of the city, and they sat in the gallery with the specific quiet of people who have been waiting for something for a long time and are now watching it happen and are not entirely sure they believe it is real. The prosecutor walked her through the stop, the cell, the morning, her training, her background, her decision-making. She answered each question in the same register she had used with Okafor 11 weeks ago. Direct, specific, without ornamentation. She did not perform emotion because she didn't need to. The facts, stated plainly, were the performance. Cross's attorney cross-examined her for 40 minutes. He tried 3 angles. That she had been predisposed to distrust the officer, that her military training gave her an advantage in managing the situation that ordinary citizens wouldn't have, that her calm behavior during the stop was itself suspicious, evidence of someone who knew they were being observed. Emily answered each question directly, without getting angry, which she could tell frustrated him. On the last angle, the calm behavior, she said, "I was calm because I had nothing to hide, and I understood that escalating the interaction would not serve me. That's not suspicious. That's rational." She paused. Anyone who has been in a situation where the wrong response gets you killed learns to be calm. I learned it in a different context, but the principle is the same. The attorney looked at her for a moment. Then he said he had no further questions. The courtroom was very quiet. The verdicts came on a Tuesday, which struck Emily as appropriate. 22 days after the trial began, the jury filed back into the courtroom at 2:14 in the afternoon, and the 4-person read the findings one by one with the particular deliberateness of someone who understands they are speaking into a record that will outlast the room. Brandon Cross, guilty on all counts: evidence tampering, civil rights violations, perjury, conspiracy. Sentenced to 11 years, ineligible for early release before 7. His pension was forfeited. He was ordered to pay restitution to each of the 12 individuals the prosecution had been able to specifically document as victims of his stops. Leonard Wick, guilty on 4 counts including conspiracy and abuse of office. 5 years. His pension was stripped. The written directive he had signed was entered into the permanent judicial record as evidence of institutional misconduct. Raymond Stahl, guilty on 3 counts, including obstruction of justice and conspiracy, removed from the bench, sentenced to 6 years. His 11 dismissals in the relevant cases were vacated, and each of those 11 complainants was notified that their cases could be refiled. Norris Beaumont, guilty on 2 counts, pled to a reduced charge as part of his cooperation agreement, 3 years, of which he would serve 18 months. He gave testimony that corroborated Poole's account of Vare's financial involvement with enough detail to close the remaining gaps in the forensic accounting. Douglas Vare, guilty on all counts: conspiracy, racketeering, civil rights violations, obstruction, 12 years. His development entity was dissolved by court order, its assets partially liquidated to fund a victim restitution pool. He was the last to be sentenced, and he stood at the defense table and looked at the judge. A visiting federal judge brought in specifically because of Stahl's conflict, with the expression of a man who had spent 9 years being the most powerful person in any room he entered, and was now experiencing the specific disorientation of no longer being that. He didn't speak. His attorney spoke. Vare just stood there, and Emily, in the gallery. She had not been asked to be there. She had come on her own. She had taken a half day from her shift, watched him stand there, and thought that there was nothing satisfying about it in the way satisfaction was supposed to feel. It was not a movie ending. It was not cathartic. It was a man in a suit receiving a number of years that would change his life, surrounded by attorneys and reporters and the machinery of a process that had ground slowly and had gotten there. The satisfaction, such as it was not in Vare's face. It was in the gallery, where a man named Darius Holt, 43 years old, 2 tours, the 23rd complaint, was sitting 3 rows behind Emily, and when the verdict was read, he let out a single long breath and pressed his fist against his mouth and didn't say anything. She didn't know his name yet. She would later when the victim's advocacy coordinator introduced them in the corridor outside, and Holt shook her hand and couldn't quite find words and eventually said, "I filed that complaint because I didn't know what else to do. I didn't think it would matter." She looked at him. "It mattered," she said. "It mattered before we got there. You put something on the record when you had every reason to believe the record would disappear. That's not nothing. That's how the pattern became visible. He looked at her with eyes that were doing something she recognized. The specific thing that happens when you have been carrying the full weight of being disbelieved for long enough that being believed, actually believed, by someone who doesn't have to, lands somewhere it wasn't prepared for. I didn't feel brave, he said, filing it. Most things that matter don't feel like anything when you do them, she said. They just feel like the next thing you had to do. The department reforms came in stages over the following months. A new civilian oversight board with actual subpoena authority. A complaint routing system rebuilt from the ground up by an external firm with no ties to the city's existing political structure. Mandatory body cameras with chain of custody protocols that couldn't be selectively edited. 4 officers separated from the department. 6 supervisors who had received the original directive and done nothing with it, placed on administrative review. 3 were eventually separated. 2 were retained after disciplinary proceedings. 1 retired before the process concluded. It was imperfect. These things always are. The Oversight Board had jurisdictional limitations that frustrated the advocacy organizations who'd pushed for it. The body camera protocols had an implementation lag because the procurement process was slow. 2 of the 41 original complainants couldn't be located despite sustained effort. 1 had died. 3 had left the state and declined to engage with the process when found, which was their right and which Emily understood, because there is a particular exhaustion that comes from having a system fail you and then being asked by that same system to participate in its rehabilitation. She understood it, and she thought about it, and she did not have a clean answer for it. Some damage doesn't get undone. Some trust, once broken in a specific way by a specific institution, doesn't rebuild toward that institution again. It rebuilds elsewhere, toward something smaller, toward individual people rather than systems. And that is not failure. That is adaptation. That is what people do when they have to. Danny Reyes lost his position on the force. The disciplinary board found that his failure to report during the 2 stops he'd witnessed constituted misconduct sufficient for termination, which was the correct finding. He was 24 years old, out of work, with a record that made the next step complicated. Emily had no particular warmth for him. She hadn't forgiven him in any ceremonial sense, because she hadn't been asked to and wouldn't have known what it would mean, but she had not forgotten the specific thing he'd said to her across the table in room 3. I made the wrong one. It took something to say that. Not the right thing, not the sufficient thing, but something. She hoped he'd find somewhere to put it. She didn't know what happened to him after. She told herself it wasn't her responsibility to know, and that was true. And it was also true that she thought about it sometimes. 3 months after the verdicts, Westbrook Medical received a formal commendation from the DOJ's anti-corruption initiative, recognizing the department's cooperation and Emily Parker's role in the investigation. Ferris arranged a small ceremony in the hospital's main conference room. Staff from the ER, some administrators, a few people from the advocacy organizations. She stood at the front of the room and accepted the commendation in the same register she did most things, which was to say, directly, without performance, with appropriate acknowledgement of the people who deserved it. She said 3 things. She said that the 41 people who had filed complaints and been ignored were the actual origin of the case, and that without their decision to put something on the record, even when the record disappeared, the pattern would not have existed to find. She said that the program that had placed her in Fairmont City was staffed by people who did hard work in obscurity for reasons that had nothing to do with recognition, and they deserved more of it. And she said that what had happened on Route 9 was not the story. The story was the 11 years before Route 9, when a system had been quietly built to treat certain people as acceptable targets. And the question for Fairmont City now was not whether it had fixed the problem, but whether it was prepared to keep asking whether the problem had been fully found. Someone in the back of the room asked if she felt vindicated. She thought about the word, vindicated. It implied that the thing which had been done to her was the center of the story, and she had understood for a while now that it wasn't. The thing done to her was the mechanism. It was the crack in the wall through which the light, as someone once wrote, got in. She had been the tool the situation needed, and she had been willing to be used as one, and the question of whether that was brave or simply practical was something she was still working out. I feel like the work got done, she said. That's enough. It wasn't quite the answer they were looking for, but it was the true one. There. She worked the night shift 2 days later. It started the way all her shifts started. Locker room, scrubs, badge, hair, bay assignments, handoff notes, the particular rhythm of an ER getting ready to receive whatever the night decided to send. At 9:47 p.m., a veteran came in through the ambulance bay. 51 years old, chest pain, diaphoretic, pressure 88/60 and falling. The medics had him on supplemental oxygen and had pushed one round of fluids with minimal response. Emily was at the bay before the stretcher was through the door. She worked him for 40 minutes. There was a moment around the 20-minute mark where things got very close to the edge. His pressure dipped further. The attending called for a consult. Emily had 2 medications running simultaneously and was watching his color and his breathing and the monitor in the specific way that is not multitasking but is closer to having the whole situation exist in a single field of awareness. The resident beside her said something about the protocol, and she said, without looking away from the patient, "I know the protocol. Do this instead," and described a specific intervention that the resident hadn't encountered before but that Emily had used in a field setting with comparable hemodynamics. And the attending said do it, and they did. The pressure stabilized at 94/62, then 101, then 108. The man's name was Thomas Kettrick, and when he was stable enough to talk, he said, "What happened?" "You had a close one," Emily said. He looked at her badge. "You're the one who was on the news," he said. "The nurse." "I'm a nurse," she said. "Yes." He looked at the ceiling for a moment. "My nephew filed one of those complaints," he said. "Couple years back, nothing happened." He paused. "Something happened eventually." "It did," she said. He was quiet. Then, "Thank you. For all of it. Not just this." She looked at him. He meant it simply, and she received it simply without deflecting because he deserved to have it received. "Thank you for coming in when you did," she said. Another 20 minutes, and we'd have been having a much harder conversation. He almost smiled at that. She moved to the next bay. Sat. There is a thing that happens to people who have been underestimated for long enough. Not the dramatic thing. Not the moment of vindication. Not the confrontation. Not the public acknowledgement. The quieter thing that comes after, when the room has emptied and the paperwork is done and the work continues, which it always does. The quiet thing is this. You realize that the underestimation never actually touched the thing it was aimed at. It touched the surface. It touched what people saw and what they chose to believe about what they saw. But the thing underneath, the competence, the judgment, the specific knowledge of how to stay still when stillness is what the situation requires, that was never in their control. They could not take it because they could not see it. And the people who cannot see a thing cannot damage it. Emily Parker had known this, in an abstract way, for a long time. She had learned it in places that were harder than a holding cell on a Tuesday night. She had carried it through 3 years of shifting wounds and managing crises, and being the person in the room who stayed calm because someone had to, and she was the one who knew how. What Route 9 had given her, what Cross, in his absolute certainty that he had found an easy mark, had given her, was not vindication. It was confirmation. Confirmation that the thing she had been doing quietly for years was the right thing. That the way she had chosen to be in the world, not loud, not performing, just present and capable and willing, was sufficient, had always been sufficient, would continue to be. That was not a small thing. It was, in fact, the only thing that lasted after the trial ended, and the cameras left and Vare's name stopped appearing in headlines, and the 41 complainants received their notifications, and the department reformed and the oversight board convened, and the city moved on the way cities do, absorbing their own histories in the particular way of things that keep going regardless. The work kept going. The patients kept coming. Thomas Kettrick went home 4 days later, and his nephew's record was cleared. And somewhere across the city, Darius Holt received a letter that said, "The stop on the Saturday afternoon 3 months before the federal inquiry had been found to be unconstitutional, and the record expunged, and he sat at his kitchen table with the letter in his hands for a long time before he folded it and put it somewhere safe. None of these moments were connected to each other in the same room. They happened separately, quietly, in the ordinary way that things happen to ordinary people who are not the center of any story anyone is telling publicly. But they happened. And the woman who had stood on the gravel shoulder of Route 9 in the cold, with her hands behind her back and her teeth set against the urge to say everything she was thinking, and had made the choice to let the evidence speak for itself. That woman clocked in for her shift the following Tuesday, the same way she always did, 2 minutes before her scheduled start. She had work to do. She went and did it.